And now I'm passing on to Vicki.
Yes. Hello. Yes. Thank you, Claudina. Excellent. Okay. Yes, I am Vicki. I am a librarian at Newcastle Library for King County Library System. And even before the library was built, we opened in 2013 in Newcastle. And even before the library was built, I had the good fortune to meet Russ Segner. He is the current Newcastle Historical Society president. And through Russ, I have met a phenomenal group of people. Their dedication and passion towards researching, learning about, and preserving and sharing Newcastle history has just been inspiring to me. And it was through Russ that I met the gentleman that you're going to hear tonight talking about Seattle's first railroad. We hosted them in person in Newcastle Library 2 springs ago, and it was just a phenomenal program. And I'm so glad they were able to pivot and offer this online to the greater community. So I'd like to turn it over to Russ Segner right now, who is going to introduce our presenters, and then we will get on with our program. Thank you, Russ, and thanks to all our presenters.
Thank you, Vicki. I truly believe you're one of the best things that the library system has given Newcastle. So thank you for your help in making this possible. Some years ago at Newcastle Days, I had an exhibit up of a couple of photographs and maps of early activities in Newcastle, and a couple of gentlemen stopped by and we had some questions and answers about the photograph, one of which you're going to see tonight. I had no idea where that would lead because over the next several years, interest in the original mining and movement of coal to Seattle became an intense interest on the part of a couple of these people. And that's your program tonight. They've done an incredible amount of work in researching this and put together a very fine program. 2 of the people involved in this process are not presenting tonight, but they had a very big role to play in the research, and that's Eva Lundahl and Mike Entlicoffer, members of our Historical Society, dealing with research and the archives of our materials and artifacts. So without further ado, I want to introduce Kent Sullivan. Kent is the leader of this effort, and he will be basically in charge of the sequencing of the presentations tonight. Harry Dersch is one of our individuals who turns out to be a very key guy because he lives on the lake where this, some parts of this facility were located. Then Matt McCauley, and who's involved with some of the artifact retrieval process that may occur, and Gary Dutt. So gentlemen, you'll introduce yourselves as we go through this, but right now, Kent, it's all yours. Thank you again.
Thank you, everyone. And thanks for tuning in. As Russ mentioned, I'm Kent Sullivan, and 4 of us will be presenting tonight. Our group really came together, as Russ said, over the last 7 years, starting from seeing that early photo at Newcastle Days. And it built kind of slowly from there. Excuse me. I discovered a ghost of part of the route on the historic 1937 King County aerial imagery. And that really got me fired up because I thought, wow, there really was something here. And then our group just steadily kind of got bigger. Mike Entlicoffer joined us, then Gary, who I met at a Northern Pacific Railway Historical Association presentation. Matt and I already knew each other through Kirkland history, and he got really excited. So it just really kind of gradually formed. Harry joined the group and has just been great. We've all had this really interesting mix of interests and skills and abilities that has really helped to make the research really rich. And then Eva joining us, or perhaps rescued is a better term, in 2018, once we said yes to our first presentation, which was the one Vicki mentioned. So we had about 2 months to get ready, and Eva really whipped us into shape and helped us get into presenting form. And I just want to mention also, we've had some really invaluable collaboration with Kurt Armbruster, Robert Boyd, Ron Edge, John Taubeneck, Carla Terzic, and Steve Williams, among many others at research institutions and archives in this area. So Fast forward a couple of years and here we are, hundreds of person hours and one trip to California later. So let's get started. Well, PowerPoint, now would be a good time to behave yourself. There it goes. All right, good. Okay, coal from Newcastle helped create an economic boom that lasted for more than 60 years. Newcastle coal was a primary driver for Seattle's early economic growth and the reason for building its first railroad. Newcastle coal helped put Seattle and what much later became known as the Eastside on the map. When coal was first discovered, there were about 300 people in Seattle, if you can imagine that. And when mining really kicked into gear in 1870, Seattle still only had a population of about 1,000 people. This small village was desperate for a cash-generating industry. Although timber cutting and lumber milling was a big business by this time on the Olympic Peninsula, Seattle saw relatively little of the income from these operations because they were mostly self-sufficient. And here on the slide, you can see some facts and figures we've gathered from all of our research that just kind of helps set the stage and speaks to the production and the economic, the economic value to Seattle and the region. Promoters of Newcastle coal called it subbituminous, which is one of the 4 recognized grades of coal, but is sometimes thought of as being a marketing ploy to avoid being branded as lignite, the lowest grade. Nobody wants to be called lignite coal. Technically speaking, subbituminous coal is black in color and dull in appearance, while lignite is brown. Newcastle coal was widely used for household heating, but also as fuel for stationary engines, steamships, and locomotives. And in particular, the Seattle Coal and Transportation Company, which we're going to be talking about tonight, landed a really big contract with the Central Pacific Railroad, which made a big difference in their business. You might notice the ad in the bottom right corner there. We found some really fun stuff. I think either Harry or Eva found this on a trip to California. How to get rid of your mother-in-law. Make the house too hot to hold her with Seattle coal. Try it. Oh, those were the days. Okay. There were 4 distinct routes for transporting coal from Newcastle to Seattle. This evening, we are focusing on the period corresponding to routes 3 and 4. Just briefly with the other routes, I'm using my mouse pointer here. Hopefully you can see this. We don't have a laser pointer available like we would in person, but the mines were here. And the first route went up and around Mercer Island and then kind of straight across to a place called Yesler's Landing back in the day, which we think of as today's Leschi. Then up over the hill to Yesler's Wharf, which was in the middle of the village of Seattle. Very primitive. They were literally bringing small amounts of coal in sacks to basically prove that it could be done. The second route started at the same place, came out to the lake, and then was loaded very laboriously onto flat-bottomed barges, often known as scows, and pulled down the Black River and the Duwamish River around on the saltwater to the same wharf. And this was quite challenging. The Black River was often very shallow and had a lot of snags in it. So it was very, very difficult work. Routes 3 and 4, which go this way and then into Seattle like this, we're going to talk about in more detail in a minute. So I won't say too much about that now. And then the final route, which was all rail, no water involved, came down this way, the main line for this railroad, and then the Newcastle branch came up to Newcastle and later to Coal Creek. Route number 3 has many similarities to route number 4, where we're going to spend most of our time. You can see route 3 here, we've highlighted it in blue, starting at the mine and then into the water, up and around, and then briefly across about a 3/4 mile long portage, which is very close to where the Museum of History and Industry used to be, now kind of covered by the 520 expansion, and then back onto the water, then back on land, down to a wharf at the foot of Pike Street. Route number 3 initially featured mule-drawn trams between the mine and Lake Washington, which is this part over here, across the portage here, and between Lake Union and the Seattle Wharf. This route was built by the Seattle Coal Company after they bought out the Lake Washington Coal Company at the end of 1869. Although coal was handled and transferred an astounding 11 times total with this route, it was a major improvement over Route 2 and enabled production to increase. Coal transportation costs are estimated at $5 per ton via this route, which was quite a lot of money in the early 1870s. After just a few months of ownership, the Seattle Coal Company principals realized that many more and more expensive improvements were needed to further increase coal throughput to San Francisco. And in fact, prior to that, there hadn't been all that much sold to San Francisco because it was just so expensive. They also knew that kind of capital was just not available in tiny Seattle. This time, San Francisco investors were found and the companies were sold in February 1871. Seattle Coal and Transportation Company, a California entity, incorporated on April 13th of that year in San Francisco. Most of the 6,000 shares of SC&T stock, valued at $100 per share, were initially owned by the Bank of California. We'll be hearing about some of the other people involved in a bit. So Seattle Coal and Transportation kicked off a number of projects, which are described here on the screen. Really, they started to get serious is what it amounted to. They sent up engineers. They replaced some of the early rails, which were wooden with a metal top called strap iron, with actual iron rails, which were thought to be necessary before they bought a locomotive, which they did, had the first locomotive come. They bought more coal cars, new coal cars that could carry more, and then greatly improved the wharf on the Seattle waterfront in the saltwater, so they could actually start loading ships in some sort of semi-efficient manner. So just a little bit about our first locomotive. Do any of you know what it was called? It actually didn't have a name initially, but it did receive the name Ant, A-N-T, several years after its delivery. Maybe when it was no longer the first one and you couldn't just say that locomotive, I don't know. It was the first in the Puget Sound area and the 5th in Washington State. It was built at the Fulton Foundry in San Francisco because Seattle was much too small then to do a project like that, and arrived in Seattle by ship on November 21st, 1871. The price paid is unknown, but according to noted logging and mining historian John Taubeneck, a nearly identical locomotive built at the same time cost $4,000, quite a bit of money. A copy of the photo you see here is in the Prosh collection of photos at the UW Special Collections in Seattle, and is labeled as showing the first trip. However, based on the number of people and their level of attire, we think this photo is most likely from a slightly later trip where they offered the entire city of Seattle free rides on March 22nd, 1872. We are not sure whether the photographer is facing north across Lake Union from Seattle or south across the lake from the portage. The Ant ran between Lake Union and Pike Street Wharf in Seattle until the George C. Bodie locomotive entered service in September 1874. If you have a chance to look up some of the work that John's done, the article he wrote about the Ant, which we'll show you later, talks about the first 5 locomotives in Washington. He's done some great work there. So we didn't have really great photos of the Ant, but the good news was there was a twin. Constructed at the same time as the Ant, but for the Coos Bay Company in Oregon, this locomotive was built for 38-inch gauge track, 2 inches wider than what the Seattle Coal and Transportation Company used. John Taubeneck uncovered that the Flanagan and Mann's Newport Coos Bay Coal Company mine, that's a mouthful, was located about 4 miles southeast of Empire City in Coos County. It is not to be confused with the town of Newport in Benton County. These photos provide a clearer picture of what the ant likely looked like during its years in Seattle. You can see the very distinctive smoke box door in these two photos, which you can just barely make out in the photo I just showed you. In some later photos, that appears to be gone of the ant. Let's take a look at what was going on in Newcastle in those early days. In the fall of 1872, there were, according to newspaper articles, 60 men working in the mines, 15 men working in transportation, 75 to 100 tons of coal mined per day, and 25 company-built houses in Newcastle. The vintage photo on the right, used in the Coals of Newcastle book, is dated 1886, but is plausibly what the town of Old Newcastle looked like during the 1870s, since growth was not all that rapid. The caption of the photo says there were 100 homes in 1876, so there would likely have been, or 1886, excuse me, so there likely would have been fewer homes than this photo shows during the 1870s. The map on the left is projected on modern day aerial imagery, and our many thanks to Carla for creating this for us. It's based on our best information and some educated guesses. So just briefly, we'll talk more about this later. In fact, Gary will show you the exact route. You have the railroad coming in here and stopping here at the bunkers. And we've got the company store here, and here is the church. And you can see in this photo, hopefully with the mouse pointer, there's the church. And so the photographer was standing roughly right here. And this is today's 136th Avenue Southeast, which is a dead-end road. And you've got Newcastle Coal Creek Road, which is also known as the Golf Course Road here. The modern YMCA is here. This turns into 133rd Avenue today. And then this is 132nd Place, I believe it's called. It goes up to the new development here. So the railroad basically just kind of sidestepped up this hill through the apartment complex that's there today. Hard to believe that was ever there given the way it looks now. So, how did the bustling town of Seattle look in this era? Like a village that had much bigger plans. This amazing 3-panel panorama was taken from Denny Hill, now long gone. We're looking south here, and our many, many thanks to Ron Edge for doing some amazing work to stitch those panels together. You can't really even see the seams. Pike Street runs across the photo in the near foreground here. Again, hopefully you can see my mouse pointer. The main reason we include it here is it is the only known photo that clearly shows Seattle Coal and Transportation tracks in service. You can sort of see them here, and we'll zoom in a second. So we were super excited when we found that photo. Just out of the picture to the right, a few blocks down in here somewhere, would be a new 800-foot long trestle to deep water and the coal bunkers, which cost about $30,000, which is about $625,000 today. Just, I have to throw this in because Ron has done some amazing work. If you study the individual original images for the panorama, you might notice the same thing he shared with us, which we can't really see in this composite photo. In the time between the far right shot, which ended right in here somewhere, and the center shot, the trees blocking the house, he's referring to this house here, and there were more trees here blocking the house, were removed as well as the stump. I believe they are shown being burned based on the smoke. Do you see the smoke here? In the center image, just in front of the now visible house. Isn't that kind of amazing? That life was happening even while the photographer was moving the camera. So in this close-up then, you can really see the ties and the rails on Pike Street. And you can see stumps, if you can believe, stumps in the middle of Pike Street. Yes, indeed. And we were tickled to get this because it actually shows the rails and the ties. Okay, so the Seattle Coal and Transportation had a good year, really. The first full year that they operated in 1872, almost 20,000 tons of coal was produced, but it still wasn't profitable enough for the long haul, especially with coal being a commodity. and the company not being entirely in charge of what the price was going to be. So they needed to lower production costs. In 1872, planning began to revamp the route to extend the iron rails on the east side of the lake and fix some of the grade and put in a new incline down to the lake surface. But work happened pretty slowly. Finally, they shut down everything for over a year, which seems incredible, but both company records and coal shipment records in the newspapers in San Francisco verified that for over a year, Seattle Coal and Transportation basically shipped nothing to San Francisco so they could really get things overhauled. They needed a lot of capital, so they recapitalized for $3 million. There were times that it was clearly very tough. We have a letter from Charles Shattuck, who was one of the first members to go into the company and then came up here to be superintendent, to David Hughes in January of '74, which was a delight to find those letters. Indicates they weren't quite completely idled, but they were desperate for some money to pay the miners, which finally did reopen in July of '74 in anticipation of going into full production, which happened in October. Okay, so here's Route 4 shown in blue. The biggest difference is the part east of the lake. As you can see, there's a different route here to reduce the grade and building of the new incline. And this segment of the track finally got a locomotive. Operations resumed on October 18th of '74. As you can see, I've talked about quite a bit of this already. New things continued to happen into 1875. We think mainly because they started to run out of money. George C. Bodie, who was very involved in the company at this point, he was president, loaned the company $50,000 of his own money, which was a lot of money in those days, as did David Hughes and others. So clearly, we think they had to get things, they felt they had to get things back up and running as soon as they could, even though not all the new wharves were done and they didn't get to get their new locomotive quite as early as they'd hoped. So they did get it open and improvements continued during that time. And the steamer Addie was also used by a competitor at one point, the Renton Coal Company. So it was already in the area, which undoubtedly lowered the cost of buying it and bringing it. Whoops. Sorry, I hit the wrong thing. Okay, so the George C. Bodie, as I mentioned, was named after the company president, and at 10 tons was a considerably larger locomotive than the Ant, and arrived in August of '74. It was ready for operation on Yesler's Wharf and began operating in late September, after they laboriously moved it by having a section of track under the locomotive and then putting another section of track in front of the locomotive, rolling the locomotive with probably horse or oxen, and then picking up that section and leapfrogging and continuing to the rails on Pike Street, where they were able to put it on the Seattle Coal and Transportation tracks. Undoubtedly, it was rainy and muddy during that time, as it often is in the fall, so it probably was not a very fun job. Okay, so enough about that. I think it's time to turn things over to Gary to talk to us about a lot of that work that happened on the east side of the lake during the upgrade period.
Okay. Hey, I can't see the slides. Let me see if there we go. Sorry.
No, that's fine.
Okay, let me minimize that. My name is Gary Dutt. I do not currently live in the Newcastle area, but I grew up there. And my connection to this was when I was a kid, my parents told me that they built their house on top of the coal route. So that's how I got started here. So what you are seeing here is a 1937 aerial photograph of the area. Not much has been built at this point. There's, I don't think I have control of the mouse. Do you, Kent? Lake Washington Boulevard is kind of going north and south over to the left side of the photograph. And then you have a few other roads that have been built, but not much. Let's go ahead and go one click forward. What you see in blue is the actual route of the tramway on the east side of the lake. And we know this from two different sources. One is this photograph. You can see most of the route, even though this photograph was taken, oh gosh, over 50, almost 60 years later than when this tram was actually used. It still was quite apparent. Also, we have a survey that came down of a road that was going to be built on this line in 1878 when the line closed. And what I did was I plotted that survey right on this picture as you see it here, and it gave us the complete route. We start down, let's go one slide forward. Okay, here's the same route on a modern map. So this might tell you a little bit more. Okay, Kent, go ahead and go one more. All right, so we start off in the very far right where it says 490 feet, 495 feet. That's above lake level, essentially. The mines at this time, 1874, 1875, would have been just below that, just to the south of the number 5. And that would have been the number 3 and the number 4 seams were being mined at that time. The coal was taken out of the mines and into a loading facility. We do not have a picture of that loading facility from that time. We do have one from that area about 25 years later. The mining operations went back and forth in that area over the years. But at that point, it was just coming out of a water level mine in small mine cars, and then it was being cleaned and loaded into slightly bigger cars, not very big, as you'll see a little later. The coal cars were about 8 feet long, 4 feet tall, and carried around 3 tons of coal. By modern standards, those are tiny, tiny coal cars. So then the line went down and it descended. Where you see the blue line, that is the descending grade with the loads. And it crossed present day, what would be present day Coal Creek Parkway, and started up the hill. The green line you see is the adverse grade. That's a grade against the loads. And even though that is against the loads, it was actually well built. It's only about 1%. It was a very shallow grade. And the steeper grades were with the loads. So this was a well-engineered line compared to some of the earlier routes. That green line goes in front of present day Newcastle Library up that hill. And then from there, there's really no roads or anything that modern day roads that go on the route. It reaches the summit up in the middle of Newport Hills, and it continues north to where it makes a big turn. And for those of you who are familiar with the area, that is the Newport Hills Shopping Center. And then it can cut through the track area of the Ringgold Middle School. Again, all that's obliterated today. It eventually ended up at the end of the blue line to the left, over 230 feet above the level of the lake. And when they got to that spot, they really wanted to get to the lake right where you see the end of the red line. And to do that, they're pretty high up. They would have had to build a couple more miles of railroad, and they're really running out of area to go to the north. So what they did at that point was to build an incline. Let's go to the next slide. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this slide here. What we have here is very special photographs taken around 1874. The one on the left is the top of the incline, and you're looking towards Lake Washington. And you can't quite see it. It's cropped out of this photo, but you can actually see Mercer Island on the other side, just a little bit of it. And I've plotted this and the shoreline of Mercer Island, and I can, to help verify this location. We later verified it through some other means. But what you're seeing here is an incline. It's 3 rails. There's a coal car, as you can see there, just starting down. And this is during the construction, so it might not be fully loaded. But as it went down, the loaded coal cars went down, there would be another coal car, an empty one at the very bottom. And if you zoomed in, you would actually be able to see it. It's down near the lake. And the loaded coal car would actually, would pull up the empty coal car. And they would do this one at a time, up and down, 3 tons at a time. And they would have to average about 100 trips a day. So they were doing this all day long. Now there's some other features. Oh, I should mention, now you might ask, well, you have 3 rails and when the coal cars hit in the middle. But in the very middle, the 3 rails split into 4. And you can't see it in the left-hand photo, but in the right-hand photo, kind of right where the light spot is in the middle, that is a passing area. Yeah, thanks, Kent, that's perfect. And that's where the coal cars would pass. Now, in the left photo, there's a gentleman on a platform, he has the control of a big wheel that's basically a brake. It's control for a brake. He's from that platform, he is watching the whole operation and he controls it from there. To his right is a boy holding a horse. Now that boy, we're estimating he's probably 10, 12 years old. He's barefoot. You can't really tell in this photo, he's barefoot. That horse that he has is how they move the individual coal cars to get them into position to lower them and raise them. The ant locomotive, or later the Bodie locomotive, would bring a string of coal cars in, but that locomotive, there was only one locomotive on this portion of the line at a time. So that locomotive was needed to go back and forth to the mine. So they used horses to bring these coal cars to position. And it's kind of amazing to think that this kid is a young kid, barefoot. Obviously the work time regulations workplace regulations were a little different back in the 1870s. Another thing you can notice is in the middle of that photograph, way down in the cut, there's a group of men. And so we think this picture was taken while the incline was still under construction. It's just about complete, but not quite. So again, I don't think I'd want to be in that cut there, being below that loaded car as it's coming down. That would not be a good spot to be. But do remember that cut. That'll come up in a few minutes. Okay. Another thing is, okay, just to give you a kind of an idea, the top of this incline is at the 5400 block of Lake Washington Boulevard. And we think that the trestle work that's just over the top of the horse, we think that is basically where the present day Lake Washington Boulevard is today. It was not built until much later after this time. It wasn't completed until about 1920, but it was about 50 years after this time, at least 40. People were allowed to ride the incline, interestingly enough. And there is a report of 9 miners, or 9 workers at least, that were in a car and it started to run away. Luckily, they did all jump and were saved. Other folks would come out from Seattle and ride the coal cars up to get to Newcastle for dances and things like that. So let's move to the right picture. This is the bottom of the incline. Basically, we think it was taken the same day. Looking up, at the very top is a couple of buildings. They don't show up very well, but there would be the hoist buildings at the very top. To the left, you see a donkey engine, a donkey steam engine. We believe that was used to help unload coal cars or load coal cars onto the barges. These photos are early photos. The facilities at the bottom are not actually fully built yet. And in a few minutes, Harry will tell you about all the facilities and the activity down at that end of the incline. Let's go to the next slide. This is an example of what would have been at the top. Now, this is a picture from Wales. They use this process, these inclines, a lot longer than we did. In fact, this piece of equipment on the right is still existent in Wales. And what you have is you have a continuous cable that goes over the top of this drum, winds around it, and then it comes out on the left underneath. That way, when one coal car was loaded and was pulling the drum and was letting the line out, it was pulling the line in for the other car. And it's a pretty simple mechanism. It would have a brake on there. In fact, the brake mechanism is on the left side of this drum in this picture. So we don't know exactly what that looked like up there. We don't have a close-up photo, but this is essentially the very simple mechanism that would have been used for the incline to make it work. Let's go to the next slide. And here's an example of an early steam donkey engine. This was very similar to the one you would see, and we saw in that picture. It's a single drum, meaning it only had one line on it, and essentially it could only go out with that or go in with the line, and you probably have to use a horse or manual labor to actually pull the line out. Let's go to the next slide, please. So here's an interesting aerial photo taken in 1929, a little bit earlier than the 37 one we saw earlier. What you see there, now there's a little bit more development, but not much, is you see Lake Washington Boulevard. It's a gravel or dirt road going down the middle. There is a little road that goes off to the left down to the lake, and right there at the top where those intersect is basically the top of the incline. You do see some development down the lake. There's certainly houses down there, and there's also the Northern Pacific Railway has their line in at this point. What you do not see is 405 or its predecessor. That road is yet to be built. In the middle is a gash, and that is the trench that you saw, the cut you saw that those workers were in the earlier picture. So this is over 50 years later since the incline and the tramway were shut down, and you can still clearly see the dash, the cut in the line there. Now later on, 405 or its predecessor was built, and approximately half of this area there was obliterated by that construction. So, but we can still see part of it today. Let's move on to the next slide. Okay, well, we'll get to that in a minute. So one thing we did was we were trying to find the actual location of that incline. We had the photo. Few people thought it was originally to the south. I happen to know that the tram line went a little bit more towards the north because I knew it went through my property, which would be about 2 lots south of the top of the tramway. Well, so Kent and I went to the King County Archives and we found this record. And that record is what you see on the right. And this is a description of a piece of property that you see in green, kind of a funny shaped piece of property that the Seattle Coal and Transportation Company leased. And what I did was I interpreted the handwriting that you see there and I plotted the coordinates on a modern day map. And that's what you see there is that wedge of property. And the incline actually went down the very middle of that property. So that really narrowed it down for us. And let's go to, and oh, by the way, the incline was about 1,000 feet long. It was pretty long. Let's go to the next slide. Now here are modern day photos of that cut that you saw in the early photos. The photo on the left is looking down from basically the Lake Washington Boulevard direction towards Lake Washington. And just beyond those trees that you see in the cut is the fence for the 405 freeway. And since this picture has been taken, the 405 is being widened, and actually some of those trees are long gone now, so a little bit more of the cut was taken away. The picture on the right is taken from the bottom, looking up towards the house that owns this property. It would be towards Lake Washington Boulevard, so that would be looking up the hill to the top of the incline. So there is evidence today of the incline from 1874 to 1878. A few members of our group did go with metal detectors and looked around in the cut, but they didn't find anything significant. And here's a picture of our group, along with the homeowner, taken, oh gosh, it's been a while back, in this earlier this year. And this photo actually did appear in the Seattle Times for a Now and Then piece on Sunday. So I don't know if folks saw that, but you can go to the archives, the Seattle Times archives. You can see this photo, and there's a few more that were not published that are located there if you want to see a little bit more of what this area looks like today. I think that's the last slide I'm going to talk about. I'm going to turn this over to Harry, and he's going to talk to you, and Harry's the third one from the right there. He's going to talk to you about the lake operations, the barge operations, and what was going on down at that end.
Okay. Good evening, Harry Dersch here. And Kent gave us an overview and talked about Route 3. And now I'm going to talk about, Gary got us down to the lake, got the coal from the mine, down the incline to the lake. Now we got to get the coal over to Seattle and then shipped on down to San Francisco. So I'm going to talk about how the coal left the lake to begin its journey to Montlake, kind of where Husky Stadium was, about a 5-mile journey. Matt's going to take us from Husky Stadium to the clipper ships waiting for the coal in Seattle. And then I'm going to pick it back up again and talk a little bit about the challenging journey from Seattle down the coast to San Francisco, which was the customer for the vast majority of Newcastle coal. So this is one of our classic photos that we have. I think the 2 incline photos that Gary showed and the photo here of the quick step. Just 3 of the classic photos that make up our presentation, at least from a maritime perspective. And by the way, my tie into all this is I live about 4 houses from where the incline intersected Lake Washington. I've taken Matt out, who's going to talk to us later, taken Matt out diving, looking for artifacts, remnants. And we did find a lot of milfoil, A lot of beer bottles, some golf balls, but no real artifacts left over from this era, which is not surprising. And also considering the lake has been lowered 9 feet since these photos, since this was a landing. So what are we looking at here? We're looking at the Quick Step, which is one of the mosquito ferries that ran from Leschi or Yesler's Way at that time, Yesler's Landing, over to Newcastle. The Quick Step ran 3 times a day, except for Sundays. And then in the evenings, you would do a route around Mercer Island for a nice evening cruise. This relates to our Route 4 from the mid to late 1870s, as shown in the next photo, Kent. So this is what happens when you stare at a photo for a couple of years. All of a sudden, you start to pick up things you otherwise wouldn't have seen. As one of the things that is in this photo that doesn't really relate to this presentation, but I think it's worth bringing up, is Captain John Anderson and his new wife, Emile. This is the second steamer that John owned. He was not even 30 years old yet. And for those who know Lake Washington history, John became the dominant ferry boat captain up until the floating bridge was put in 1940. He had a career of building and managing the mosquito fleet, a love-hate relationship with King County, and ran the ferry system until 1940, and then he actually passed away a year later in 1941 at 71 years old. The whole presentation could be made about John Anderson, but here's a photo of him docking the Quick Step at Newcastle Landing. And what we see in the foreground is what we believe to be the initial landing that was shown in the incline photos that Gary just showed us. And what you see in the back, if you could highlight that a bit, Kent, between the Quick Step and the waiting room is a coal wharf. So the coal cars came down to Lake Washington, but what did they do with them when they got to Lake Washington? How did they get them onto the barges? As Gary mentioned, it was 100 trips a day, 6 days a week, 100 times a day. Those 3-ton coal cars are going down, and then the empty ones were being used as counterbalance going back up. But what did they do with those? And so here you see remnants of a coal wharf in the bow of the Quick Step, and you also see a rail line taking the cars from the landing, from the base of the incline, over to the coal wharf. And what else I'd like to point out too is you see the 2 stages waiting to take the passengers up to Newcastle. Again, this was a regular scheduled route, 3 times a day. They had stagecoaches waiting for the passengers. And what I like to point out is that this is probably most likely the first traffic jam ever on the east side of Lake Washington. So next slide. So we talked a little bit about the landing and the coal wharf. And here's a 1920 map that shows those 2 facilities. There's the Newcastle landing down at the bottom, and that was the ferry landing, pretty much passengers and freight. But there's a map showing the extent of the coal wharf that existed to stage the coal cars awaiting barges or after they were offloaded from barges. So they had, on average, about 3 barge trips a day from Newcastle Landing over to Husky Stadium. They took about 18 coal cars a barge. And if you do the math, that means about 3 trips each day with a tug pushing a barge back and forth. Pretty remarkable. This whole system that we're discussing tonight is single point failure. There was no backup if the incline cable snapped. There was no backup if a tug went out of service. There was no backup if Lake Union froze. It was just a continuous 24/7 almost operation of getting the coal from Newcastle to the salt water. And we're going to talk a little bit later about production rates. They did about 100,000 tons a year during the heyday of this route, which means about 100 cars going up and down the incline and about 3 trips daily, the tug pushing the barge. So there we have the outline of what the coal wharf looked like. That was for staging the coal cars. Next slide. Here's an aerial photo. So I'm going to focus a little bit in the next few slides on that coal wharf because it was such a significant structure. So here's an aerial photograph of late 1930s showing the Pleasure Point, which is the point in the foreground there. Newcastle Landing was in the middle of that little bay, and the coal wharf was at the following point. And then in the background, you see Newport Shores. Before it was Newport Shores. And just for orientation, the Sea Hawk training camps have got a couple miles south of this photo. So a nice aerial photo showing what it looked like in 1930. You can kind of see Lake Washington Boulevard up there in the right-hand corner a little bit, right there. Next slide. So it's amazing what you can see when you have high resolution photos and you start staring at them. There you see the pilings in 1938, the remnants of 1875 Cold Wharf. Those pilings have been there for 65 plus years. And it closely aligns to the map from the 1920s. So there we have our Cold Wharf. Very large structure, 460 feet long by 12 to 50 feet wide at various points. And you can see how it's oriented so that the barge comes in and unloads the coal cars and then immediately is oriented just to head right back to the Montlake. There was no having to take a 90-degree turn. It's just oriented towards its destination. Next slide, please. And so here's another photo of those pilings taken in the late 30s that made up the Cold Wharf. This is probably 30 to 40 of the pilings, and maybe there were, I'm making a guess, of 150 pilings total. And you might ask yourself, Harry, why are those pilings so tall? And then you might realize that they lowered the lake 9 feet in 1916 when they put in the ship canal, so that's why those are so tall. Another backstory to these pilings, our first mayor, Henry Atkins, 1870, he had a 1-year tenure. And before and after being mayor, he was the pile driver in Puget Sound. So it's easy to, and we have documentation that Dick Atkins and his team were the pile drivers. Our first mayor of Seattle drove these piles for the Cold Wharf. And remarkably, here they are 65 years later. Perhaps his one legacy that he left behind were a bunch of pilings on Lake Washington. Next photo, please. And so if you were driving around the lake, you wanted to see Western Washington, there was a history book out there, historical spots of Western Washington, and it said 1936. One of the things that you can do is you can drive over to Newport and take a look at the pilings because of the remnants of the old wharf at what they call Bensonville or Newcastle Landing. So it actually made the historical spot driving guide book. So next slide, please. So here's what it looked like circa 1875. Artist rendition. You have the tram showing up in the upper right hand. If you can show that with the mouse there, thank you, Kent. And then that's the start of the incline. So there's a photo of the incline. The incline goes down to Newcastle Landing. The coal cars are given a 90-degree turn. We're not sure how they got powered over to the Cold Wharf. Maybe ox, maybe steam, we don't know. Perhaps we'll never know. Remember, this system right here was in use from late 1874 to early 1878. And then it all got bypassed because they completed a railroad around the south end of Lake Washington. The day that railroad was completed, this whole operation was dismantled. And there you see a tug pushing a barge of about 18 coal cars on its way to Montlake. And there's the ferry at the ferry landing. And that ferry landing was in service until the lake was lowered in the 1916 era. So for about 4 decades, that was how you got by boat to Newcastle area. You took the ferry from Leschi to Newcastle. And then when the lake was lowered, they actually moved the landing a little bit south of Pleasure Point to the Hazelwood area. And that landing lasted until about the mid-1930s. By then, it was easier just to drive around. So I'll be back in a bit to talk about the trip to San Francisco, but Matt's going to take us from Newcastle Landing all the way to Saltwater.
And just briefly, while we're changing speakers, we sure wish we had a photo of the operation on the lake. This is actually from Lake Whatcom, from the Blue Canyon coal mine up near Bellingham, but this would have looked very similar to what we had down here.
Am I up? Hi, my name is Matt McCauley. I'm going to talk a little bit about the lake transportation, but just to give everybody a little bit of perspective, if you think back to the old movie, The Great Escape, everybody had a different job. You get the forger, the scrounger, the tunnel king. For our little team, I'm the diver. So put that into perspective. getting steamboats into Lake Washington in the 1870s was an incredible difficulty. First of all, there weren't that many steamboats in the greater Seattle area. Second of all, you didn't have a lock to get from saltwater into the lake. So in those days, prior to the lowering of the lake in 1916, there was an outflow called the Black River. Now that went away after 1916 when the lake lowered, dried up and vanished. But in those days, you had the Black River draining the lake, then you had the Cedar River going into the Black River, and then from there, the Black River Cedar River combination went into the Green River, which then became the Duwamish River. Everybody clear on that? Okay, great. But the Duwamish River went into the saltwater. So theoretically possible during certain seasons when you had higher water, because the Black was pretty shallow, that you could bring a boat from saltwater, from Elliott Bay, up through the river system and into Lake Washington. This was a rather arduous process. There was a subgroup of the Duwamish that lived on Lake Washington. Their major year-round village was located at the confluence of the Cedar River and the Black River. So a lot of times what we have reference to is them hiring these Duwamish guys to help them with ropes, physically reef these boats up over the sandbars and everything else. So it was pretty difficult to get a boat into Lake Washington, but when you have a financial motive like getting the coal through, you manage to figure out a way to do it. These boats were very small. They were little wooden steamers. They were coal fired in order to get the boiler heat up. There was a problem with boiler steamers in those days because they often tended to blow up. And that used to happen so often that the government created the U.S. Steamboat Service that would inspect the boilers. So it was pretty tough to get them up into the lake, but they managed to do it with a couple of them. We're not entirely sure which the first was. We think that it was a boat called the Clara, but there were a couple of them that came up there. What we're seeing here on the lower right is how they would get, Harry alluded to this and we saw the picture before, how they would get the coal cars on barges from the coal wharf at the Newcastle Landing area over to the receiving wharf, which was located near Montlake. You've got that little isthmus there. So it was important for them to be able to bring the barges in, move the cars across the top of the isthmus, and then put them on another barge, and then take them down to the south end of Lake Union. At that time, that little isthmus between the lakes was owned by a guy named Harvey Pike, P-I-K-E. His dad was the namesake of Pike Street, John Pike, at the bottom of which we have today the Pike Place Market. Harvey was a carpenter and land clearing kind of guy. So in exchange for having worked on the Territorial University, they gave him this land as payment. And they all knew that it was going to eventually be a canal. So he was there, the company approached him, and they made what's called a railroad cut, which is to say that they sort of leveled things out. They made a cut, and they were able to then roll the cars off the barge from the lakeside, then down, put them on a barge in the Lake Union side. Those would be barged on a steamboat called the Clara to the south end of Lake Union, where they would then be towed behind the little ant locomotive that Kent mentioned to the foot of Pike Street, where they were then loaded onto the saltwater side of the lake, the coal company wharf, and put into bunkers and then loaded onto ships. It was a Rube Goldberg, very arduous process, but that's how they did it. Bringing barges up into the lake was also rather complicated. They had kind of two different sizes. They had an 18-car barge and they had a 36-car barge that were used later. Kent, why don't you go to the next one? So as I move into the next part, these are much later photos. The one on the left, my dad took in 1964, and that's what was then the new 520 bridge during a windstorm. The one on the right, I took from as close as I to the same spot in the year 2016 before they dismantled the 520 floating bridge. But that gives you kind of a clear idea of what a windstorm looks like in Lake Washington, because we talk about this in the abstract and it's like, oh, a windstorm. Really look closely at that. That's what it looks like on Lake Washington. Sort of freeze that in your head. Okay, go ahead and So January 1875, we had one of the little steamers called the Chehalis taking a barge of 18 cars from Newcastle Coal Wharf up to the Portage. Thing about Lake Washington is if you're over by Harry's house there at Newcastle Landing, that's relatively protected because of the East Channel. You get north of Mercer Island into that middle wide open area, wind is really, really, really dramatic. So we don't know if they just decided, you know, it doesn't look that bad, let's give it a try, or we don't know too many details about it. But on January 12th, 1875, you got the Chehalis with a load of 18 cars struggling its way up to the Portage. And it gets caught in one of these major blows, like what you saw in the pictures, probably a lot closer to the color one, where you got the big white rollers all over the place. Now, you have to keep in mind, this is a really tiny steamboat, and they've got this barge hooked up to it. These guys are wearing woolen clothing. There's no life jackets. And this thing is rocking and rolling all over the place. If they were to go into the water, the odds are very good they're dead. The cars are sort of lashed on and they're, you know, cruising their way through. But when you look at 19th century news accounts of what had happened, you know, in the 19th century, they were very deliberate in their use of language. It's like watching a British costume drama, like Howard's End or, you know, Downton Abbey or something like that. They're very specific in their use of language. So at that time, when it was described as having careened and lurched. Well, to careen is to move side to side, and to lurch is to tilt and to roll. That happened, and 18 coal cars worth $75 each went into Lake Washington. These guys must have been terrified because the odds were really good they could have been dragged down with them, but that didn't happen. You know, one of the funny things is when you watch movies or TV shows and these people go flying into the cold water and they start swimming and talking and doing all these other things, that doesn't happen. Personally, I've been in Lake Washington in February when I've had a boat sink out from underneath me. Was raising a World War II airplane off the bottom of the lake in 1984 with a friend, a lift bag over pressure relief valve ice up, and it took a 17-foot boat down with us, and we went into the water. Here's what happens when you go into really cold water in February. You lose the ability to control your breathing. You start hyperventilating, and it makes you want to panic and do all kinds of terrible things. So they knew that to go into the water would mean death. So they were probably rather relieved that the cars went over to the side and they were to make it over to, they were able to make it over to the Portage. Now, the cars went into 200 feet of water, one of the very deepest spots on the bottom of the lake. The lake is at its very, very deepest, only 215 feet. To dive to 200 feet takes quite a bit of effort. There was a friend of mine back in the 80s, late 80s, who was doing some survey work, getting ready for the new 520 bridge. And they found these cars on the bottom. There's a whole string of them down there in 200 feet of water. Many of them are actually upright, as you can see in the photograph there, and they still have coal in them in many cases. And one of the things about the bottom of the lake is it's completely pitch black, there's no light, and there's very low oxygen. So the deterioration level is very low. So you've got these cars sitting on the bottom that look a lot like they did when they went down in January of 1875. What ended up happening? Well, they did make it in. No guys were lost, thank goodness. The cars were $75 each, and through lost revenues and everything else, it put the company out about $2,000. So that was one of the high adventures on Lake Washington in a very early time. Go ahead and click us to the next one. So I have a friend named Scott Boyd who took his camera gear down and got some photographs of the cars on the bottom. To dive to 200 feet is really tricky because the deeper you go, you have the issues of the bends and all these things that people are more familiar with, but also the nitrogen. You know, the breathing medium that you breathe when you're underwater is a mixture of oxygen and nitrogen. But the problem with the nitrogen is it serves as kind of an intoxicant as you get deeper. So the deeper you get, the harder it is to stay sober, basically. So one of the advents of the last number of years for sport diving has been a mixed gas where they replace the nitrogen with helium. So Scott and his friends were able to go down and visit these, and he was still able to manipulate his camera and get some really interesting shots of these sitting on the bottom. And this is one of them. And again, that's about 200 feet. These are just a little bit south of the 520 bridge, sort of out off Bill Gates' house. Is there another sub file to this, Ken? Another photo?
Sorry, Matt.
Is there another car photo, or do we go into the next slide?
This is the last car photo.
Okay, go ahead.
And keep this design in mind. This is going to be important later, the design of the side of the car.
Right. Sorry, I didn't hit on that. Yeah, the support. Now, these were made locally too, by the way. But yeah, that distinct V shape should be noted. Thank you, Ken. So I mentioned having done an airplane, a World War II airplane back in the 80s. I did that with another guy that was a friend of mine from high school, from Mercer Island High. We both graduated in 1982. We started messing with this stuff back in 10th grade. My friend Jeff kept going with all of this. And I kind of, got married and had kids and did other businesses, but he kept at it. So last summer, I convinced him to take his 85-foot boat and some equipment out. And we found these things, and we dropped a remotely operated vehicle down on them. I didn't actually dive them personally because I'm 55. I don't really do that anymore. But we got a little remotely operated vehicle down on a couple of the cars. And one of the things that we did, we rigged up a manipulator arm on the front of the ROV using some spatulas that I bought at the Ballard Fred Meyer. And we actually recovered, I know it's kind of hard to see here, but we recovered a piece of coal from that car that was lost in 1875. So there was that. And Harry was out there with his boat. And if we didn't have Harry, we wouldn't have been able to do it because he actually pulled the stern of Jeff's 85-footer over so we could make it happen. But we do have an artifact from that now. And we think it would be great to bring one or more of these cars up, preserve them, put them on display so that you don't have to go through what I did to be able to look at them. But we'll see what happens there. Go ahead, Kim. When you got to the portage side, here we're looking east. We're sort of up on the hillside looking east at the portage around 1899. What they've done is they've taken Harvey Pike and the Seattle Coal and Transportation Company's rail grade they had excavated back in the 1870s. They dug it out deeper and turned it into a log ditch. So they had a ditch between Lake Washington and Portage Bay so they could bring logs out from Lake Washington. Because at that time, they were still logging the shores of the lake. It was a lot easier to just float them out through the lake and bring them down because there were some big mills on Lake Union. But that is where it was easier to do it that way than to just dig a whole new ditch. So that was the old rail grade that was turned into a ditch by the turn of the 19th and 20th century. Go ahead, Ken.
Sorry.
So that's all right.
There it is. There it is.
Okay, so fast forward up to 1929. Now we've had it opened in the construction began earlier, but what opened in 1916 is the Montlake Cut, which you see towards the top of the photograph with the Montlake Bridge going over it. But if you move your eyes down south about where 520 comes through today, you see a cut going through there. That was originally the rail grade, later the log ditch. And prior to 1963, it was still very, very visible right there. It's kind of hard for me without a pointer, but in this picture, you can actually see, if you look over to the right side, you can see the old shoreline where when the lake was dropped, it went out. So you have the old shoreline about where Ken is showing there, and then that's where the cut starts. And the reason it was a little angle like that is they actually, that was the closest point between the two, was to do it at that slight angle. So that's why they did it in that way. But that was all mostly obliterated in 1962, 63 range when they put 520 through. There are little remnants of it up until recently, and now it's pretty much all gone, but we have it in pictures. So we had on Lake Union, they had their own dedicated steamer called the Clara, which was a very early one, and the Lena C. Gray. The Lena C. Gray, we've got different reports about. It sounds like at least at one point in this vessel's life, you were able to roll a locomotive onto it. They'd hook up some belts and some other things and actually use the locomotive to propel the vessel. We'd like to see more details on that. But ultimately what happened is that was disassembled later. When the company came to an end, they started pulling everything up from the rails to the spikes to the Lena C. Gray. They took it all apart. And there is no drawings or photos we've ever been able to find, but it sounds like quite an interesting thing to have seen. And then there were the two categories of barges. There was the 18 car, which would have been used back when the string of 18 flipped and went into the lake. And then later they had a 36 capacity barge. Click. So this is an old map. It's kind of hard to see. Kent had to do a little bit of magic to lighten it up. But what you see at the very south end of Lake Union is a ferry slip. This is an 1875 map. And it is from that ferry slip, then along the blue line, they would take the locomotive, first being the ant, pull the string of cars down this route, what later became what the rest of the streets do, and then ultimately come down to what is Pike Street, named after Harvey Pike's dad. And down at the foot of Pike, they would go to the company saltwater wharf and its bunkers, from which the coal would be placed into the bunkers and then loaded onto the sailing ships for transport to San Francisco. But keep in mind the areas, you look at the map there, the area between downtown Seattle and Lake Union is this dense forest. The only clearing you see up by Lake Union is David Denny and Thomas Mercer's homestead. But the rest of that, you're cutting through thick woods, which, you know, changed a little bit since then. I think that's the end of me, right, Ken?
Yes, and this was just a close-up of the ferry slip there on Lake Union. It was a similar kind of design to what we saw on Lake Washington, where there was a pocket for the barge to go into.
Right, hence a slip.
Exactly.
Yeah, right there. But that really tells us a lot, being able to see detail.
Yes. Okay, so the third locomotive that the company bought was named the Georgina, and we assumed they bought it as soon as they could afford to do that, because surely using the Bodie to power the Lena C. Gray had its challenges. Because remember, they had 3 sections of land, 2 locomotives, so unless you wanted to continue to use oxen or something on the portage, that's why we think they put the Bodie on the barge and used it to power across Lake Union and then run the cars back and forth on the portage. So they wanted to quit that as soon as they could. It's probable that the large guaranteed contract they had with the Central Pacific Railroad was the deciding factor to them having enough capital to buy the third locomotive. Not only was the Georgina a twin to the Bodie, the 2 locomotives share the same page in the Baldwin Locomotive Company handwritten order book. And thanks to Gary for digging that out from the Baldwin records. This also suggests that the 2 locomotives might have been specified and even ordered at the same time, with the delivery of the Georgina deferred or postponed later once it was clear the funds were short. That happened fairly often, especially with small railroads. We don't know the origin of the name Georgina. George C. Bodie was not married, as far as we have been able to learn, so the name is unlikely to be a Bodie family namesake. However, since it was an identical twin of the Bodie, perhaps the name was intentionally a derivative. Once the Georgina arrived, it replaced the Ant on the mine to lake run, and the Ant moved to the portage, allowing the Bodie to focus on the Lake Union to wharf segment. However, SC&T sold the Ant to the Seattle and Walla Walla Railroad, which built the eventual all-rail route to Newcastle, in February 1877, a full year before the old line was decommissioned. And they needed that locomotive to help with Seattle and Walla Walla construction. It's clear from newspaper accounts that the SC&T went back to using 1 locomotive on both sides of Lake Union at that time. The Georgina is mentioned specifically in one account as being in that service. So apparently the Bodie and Georgina switched places at some point. This bird's eye view drawing, which again, I believe we got from our friend Ron Edge, thank you, Ron, is fantastic for understanding a bit about the SC&T wharf operations and the relationship to the Seattle and Walla Walla Railroad. If you look closely, which I'll show in a second, you'll spot the George C. Bodie, or what we assume might have been it. The Seattle and Walla Walla coal wharf was originally built for the Renton Coal Company and was located where the King Street is today. So here's that. You see the Seattle Walla Walla coming onto the map here. This is when it was still tide flats. So this is way before it was all filled in. So it was all on trestle work. And then over here, you've got what we think, you know, it's fun to think that it would be the Bodie. Of course, there's not that much resolution. Bringing a train of coal cars down what was later to become Westlake, as Matt mentioned, making that turn to the right onto Pike Street, and then down Pike Street to the incline, and down the incline to the wharf, and the wharf to the bunkers and to waiting ships. This photo was apparently taken out the back window of the Peterson Brothers photography studio shortly after they arrived in Seattle. So the timing here was excellent for us on this project. And we didn't go into this in this presentation, but photography was a big, fat, hairy deal in those days. It literally took a wagon load of equipment to take a photo. And that's partly what makes the incline photos on the east shore of Lake Washington so special, because it would have been a major, major production to get the equipment out there to do that. And we think probably the reason they paid all that money to do that was to be able to prove to the stockholders that the work was actually getting done in San Francisco. Note the two-level wharf and the side view of the Pike Street incline, which I'll show in a second, which is more visible in the close-up. But here's the wharf, two-level, bunkers here, see the bunkers, and then sailing ships. And then here you can see the incline coming down, and if I click, there's a bit more detail there you can see. Of course, this was done before any regrading was done, so these were quite steep downhills to the saltwater. Okay, so this photo was taken about a year later. Everything looks about the same, right? Got ships, you got a wharf. Hey, wait a minute, what's going on here? So if we compare the two, there's kind of a big difference. Do you see? Now you see them in terms of the bunkers, and now you don't. Well, you kind of do, they're down here in the water. The bunker collapsed on June 10th, 1877. A large loss of life was avoided due to workers being redirected away from the bunkers to the incline, which is up to the right, to re-rail a coal car. Thank goodness for that. And also due to the ship's crews that were docked there being called to breakfast. Worms, which were called teredos in those days, were later blamed for destroying the pilings. The company knew something was afoot because the bunker had started to sag the previous week, but they couldn't believe it was near collapse after just 2 years of service. The two ships moored at the bunker at the time of the collapse were the Western Shore and the Washington Libby, as reported by the newspapers. What timing the Peterson brothers had in taking the second photo. As far as we know, it was not commissioned as part of the investigation. It was just great luck on our part. As a note, the drawing or photograph of the Western Shore painting, which is what that is originally as a painting, comes from the article Lumber and Ships in the Forest History newsletter in 1970. And I think Harry might have found that online. That was a really good find. He's going to talk a little bit more about the Western Shore in a minute. Okay, one more thing about the waterfront. In this zoomed in segment of a larger panorama, which again we have Ron Edge to thank for, I believe, we can see some of the details of the incline. One of the buildings at the top was very likely Seattle Coal and Transportation Office and the Superintendent's Residence, which we see listed in the 1876 Seattle City Directory. Charles Shattuck and his family lived there for several years. And here I believe you can see what's essentially First Avenue, I think. Not very level in those days, but you can see there's this covered area and then down here to the water. So another panorama from Denny Hill. Pike Street crosses the photo left to right in the near foreground. You can see it here. Similar to the 1872 panorama we looked at earlier. Here is a close-up of the left-hand side of the photo. Note the ties here, the rails here, and the wagon. The tracks were apparently just removed. Here is a close-up of this middle of the photo. Notice the two coal cars. And do you remember that design we were talking about from the ones that are on the bottom of the lake? Well, there they are. Here's one, and here's another one over here, kind of in the hidden by the garden. And here is a close-up of the right side of the panorama. Notice what appears to be more ties in the street, kind of here behind the fence. Behind the fence, or I said that already, and more coal cars on either side of the house. There's one here, and there's one here, kind of looking down into that one. A newspaper article shown here dates this photo to the spring of 1878. The second and third photos are taken from an annotated panorama that was sold by BLR Antique Maps Incorporated for $4,500 in 2018, if you can believe it. It is dated May 1878, which is likely the date that the annotated version was released. Okay, Harry, I believe we're ready for you again.
Here we go. So we got the coal from the mines, we got the coal down the incline, we got it across Lake Washington, Lake Union, up over Denny Hill, onto the ships. Now we got to get it to the customer, which turns out to be perhaps the most perilous part of the journey of the coal down to San Francisco. As a reminder, Seattle had like 2,000 people during the era that we're talking about. San Francisco was the 10th largest city in the United States. 150,000 people lived in San Francisco. And it remained the largest city on the West Coast until LA surpassed its population in the World War I era. So Seattle was very fortunate. San Francisco had gold, they had silver, but they didn't have coal. Seattle had coal. So a fleet of ships, brigantines, schooners, brigs, a couple of clipper ships thrown in for good measure, some steamers were the fleet chartered by Seattle Coal and Transportation to get the coal from Seattle down to San Francisco. Not an easy thing to do back in those days. You had fog, you had current, you had tides, you had poorly maintained boats, treacherous coast, very unforgiving. You had a few lighthouses, but that was about it. It was about a 2-week journey from Seattle to the Bay Area. Here's a couple of the earliest photos that we have of some of the ships that we know took the coal from Seattle to San Francisco. Here you see the Oriola being tug assist into San Francisco. They had, even back in the day, 1870s, they had tug assist for these ships leaving Puget Sound, which was a bit surprising to me. But we have documentations that tugs would tow them out to port towns and to get them jump started on their trip down to San Francisco if needed. Unfortunately, the Oriola collided with one of our barks, one of the Seattle Coal and Transportation barks, January 9th, 1878 off of Maristone, and that bark sank with a loss of life. The Dakota, here's a steamer. Now steamers are usually used for high value product like passengers, mail, freight. But the Dakota was also used for taking coal down to San Francisco and probably returning with freight, passengers, and mail. The Dakota was in the photo that Kent showed of the Pike Street Wharf before it collapsed. You saw it taking on coal in that photo. Next slide, please. So what I call the perilous journey to San Francisco, it really wasn't a question of if, but it was when the ship would be lost, and hopefully without the loss of human life, but that did occur quite frequently. Here's a newspaper article, 1879, which pretty much covers the era that we're talking about tonight, 75 through 1878. Loss of 7 ships over that 4-year period of time, all owned or managed by Seattle Coal and Transportation. The Western Shore and the Washington Libby were the 2 of the ones that were tied to the pier when it collapsed. on the right-hand side, there is the Western Shore. Too bad we don't have a photograph of it. It was a beautiful ship. It was the only clipper ship ever built on the west coast of the United States. It was built in Coos Bay by a lumber company, Simpson Lumber, out of Coos Bay. They built it. Over 200 feet long. And its initial 2 years of its life, it ran from the Bay Area to Liverpool, taking wheat and bringing back coal and things like that, and set the records for that trip from the Bay Area to Liverpool and back again, of course, around the Cape Horn. The last 2 years of its life, unfortunately, a very short period of time, a 4-year life, it was managed by Seattle Coal and Transportation. And this took a vast quantity of coal with it. It took 2,000 tons. A lot of these barks and brigs, maybe they were in the 1,000, 1,200 ton arena. This was a 2,000 ton vessel of ballast carrying coal. And middle of 1878, the records tell us that it was on the way to entering San Francisco Bay, and the drunken skipper, that was their quote, the drunken skipper mistook a lighthouse for a schooner, or a schooner for a lighthouse, ran it aground. Luckily, no loss of life, but the clipper ship was a total wreck, 4 years of existence, and just indicative of the challenges that it was to get the coal from Seattle down to the Bay Area. Again, you can do a whole presentation on the ships used to get the coal down there. It gradually transitioned to steam by the 1885, 1890 timeframe. We had steamships taking coal. And then by about 1910, 1915, the demand was such that there was no more ocean-going delivery of coal to San Francisco. The demand for coal had been replaced by the use of oil. Cheaper coal from Montana was railroaded to the Bay. And so by about 1910, all the Newcastle coal was being used for internal consumption here to the Northwest, and none of it was being sent down to the Bay Area. Very dangerous occupation. Probably the more dangerous than getting the coal out of the mine was getting the coal down the coast to the ship, down to San Francisco. Okay. So how much coal are we talking about? So we didn't talk too much about Route 1, 2, or 3, but there you see them in the early 1870s, maybe 5,000 to 10,000 tons a year. 1876 was the first full year of Route 4, and 1877, and then by 1878, this whole system that we described tonight was replaced by a railroad. It went around the south end of Lake Washington up to Newcastle. And that happened in February of 1878. And this whole system was dismantled at that period of time. So this production rate supplied about 25% of San Francisco's need of coal. The rest of their coal came from England, Australia. For those who know their way around Vancouver Island, Nanaimo was a big producer of coal, and they actually have, their mine was called Newcastle Mine up there, named after the same town that Newcastle, Washington was named after, which was Newcastle, England. So 25% of the coal that San Francisco got came from Seattle. And here you show the production rates. This average of about 120, 130, 150,000 tons a year stayed pretty constant until World War I era. And then come World War I, it had its peak. That was the heyday of the Newcastle coal mines. They got up to almost 375,000 tons for a couple of years. And then it slowly petered out to where production stopped in 1929, followed by independent contractors who were still mining coal out of Newcastle up until the 1960s. So, Kent, back to you.
And in fact, I think Matt's going to tell us a little bit about some of the key people. And we're getting a little close on time here, but we are getting very close to the end of the presentation. So thank you for your patience, and I hope it's been interesting for you.
Okay, well, given that, I'll kind of abbreviate that. If you're old old enough to remember Saturday Night Live with Bill Murray when he's doing his Oscar predictions, where he gets to the, supporting actor and actress, and he just kind of throws them off and says, nobody cares about that. Well, what I'll do, I'll come through this pretty quickly. What you really need to take away from this is the fact that 19th century, the San Francisco money that bought out the Seattle guys that had tried to do this, they were not the Carnegies or the Rockefellers or anyone along those lines. If you want to sort of think about what they would be like, think of somebody maybe in your neighborhood around here, that had a successful business and they had a nice house and, they're doing reasonably well. These were guys out of San Francisco that had done okay. They weren't national players, but they're in the community. They had some money and they were looking for an investment. So they went and looked up in the sticks up here in Seattle. Samuel Blair, he came to the East Coast from Ireland. He was Scots-Irish, so obviously, he's an amazing person because being a Macaulay, Scots-Irish, we know that they're all incredible. We had George Bodie, who had a locomotive named after him. We don't know a ton about him. He did have a nephew who worked as a clerk up in Newcastle. David Hughes was probably a contemporaneously famous member of the SC&T leadership team. He was born in the U.S., having roots in Massachusetts, and went back to the Revolutionary War. He's well educated, left Hill, had a fleet of boats and involvement in the Central Pacific Railroad. So he was probably the heaviest hitter. But the one we all like the most is Charles Shattuck, who is the on-the-scene guy. He was the guy that was actually physically up here in Seattle at Newcastle. He had a house down at the foot of Pike Street. We see correspondence of him begging with the boards of directors to be able to pay his workers, things like that. So we all like Shattuck. One thing I would mention very quickly, if you want to learn more about these guys and a lot of the details, in 1987, there was a book put out by the Newcastle Historical Society called The Coals of Newcastle. He mentioned Eva Lundahl earlier. There's a reissue of that book coming out very soon, and it's been taken up exponentially in terms of the level of research, quality of the book, everything else. So what I would encourage everybody to do, if any of this has sparked even a slight interest in you, is to grab a copy of that book when it comes out. And believe me, you can get through all the minutiae and everything else on there because we have it all there and in the footnotes. So Kent, go ahead.
Thank you. So to start wrapping up, hopefully we've been able to show you this evening that coal definitely became a major cash crop export from Seattle, certainly rivaling timber from the Seattle area. Newcastle during this time became the second largest city in King County. And it also caused the first railroad and the first large barge operation to happen. As one of our speakers said, definitely a Rube Goldberg setup, but it did get the job done to the tune of 100,000 tons a year or more. Crazy. Yes. Just briefly about Route 5, the all-rail route. We just wanted to show you a couple of quick things. I'm really not going to spend a lot of time here. It's just the basics. The Seattle and Walla Walla Railroad was chartered in 1874. Construction didn't start till May of 76, though. It took a while to get enough money to get anything to happen. The reason for this was really Seattle was afraid they were never going to get a transcontinental railroad because the Northern Pacific thumbed their nose at them because the NP was able to buy a bunch of land really cheaply in Tacoma and make it a company town. And it was a long time coming. So they thought they were going to have to build their own route out and connect to the wider world. And that's what the Seattle and Walla Walla was initially all about. Ended up being just a local railroad. Started construction, and then the Newcastle branch opened in February of 78. We have a lot of info about that we aren't talking about tonight. It was quite a construction project. It changed names when Henry Villard bought it in 1880 and folded it into his Oregon Improvement Company. Stayed narrow gauge, 3-foot gauge until 1897, then became the Pacific Coast when Pacific Coast Coal Company came up here from California and bought the operation. Passenger service ended first, of course, because of the automobile and the relative closeness of Newcastle to Seattle. Then all service in 1930, just after the Depression started. The branch was officially abandoned with the federal agency in giving the approval in 33, and then the rails were removed, we think, about 1937. Just for fun, we wanted to show you what the May Creek trestle looks like. The one on the left is the original narrow gauge trestle that had kind of an S shape to it. And the one in the center, they're building the standard gauge trestle in 1897. And we have a high-res photo of this, and just, it's amazing what you can see here. There are people standing on this darn thing. There's a guy here, and here, two guys sitting here, like there's no big deal. A guy here, and then this guy, I think, is the one that makes my stomach do the flip-flops. He's standing there leaning on the side, and he's got a hand drill pointing back at the trestle. So in order to operate that, he would have had to have leaned over to operate the drill. So boy, that's not the kind of work for me, that's for sure. So that just gives you a glimpse. This was a very big trestle. I think we were just calculating it recently, right? Isn't it about 120 feet high roughly, and over 1,000 feet long?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, big structure. And it was all untreated lumber, of course. And here it is from the top, about 1932, after the branch was abandoned, but before or roughly when the branch was going to be abandoned, but before the rails were pulled up. And that's why we think it was safe for kids to be out there. But I don't think many parents would have their kids out on a railroad trestle these days. But we think this is probably looking east towards Newcastle. Clearly very, very high up in the air.
So this shows you what had to be built to get to Newcastle to eliminate the whole maritime system that we just spent some time describing to you.
That's all. Right. It was not a simple task. And then just briefly, number of books we used, a book by Frederick Grant, A History of Seattle. This article by Homer Benton from the 1960s was really, really helpful. And it was amazing the amount of work he did without benefit of the internet and while living in California. He might have come up to look at newspapers at the University of Washington, but he did an amazing amount of work from a long way away before modern technology existed. And then this is the article by John Taubeneck I mentioned. That was a great source for us. And then this is the Coles in Newcastle Matt mentioned. And here is a picture of the cover of the new edition. It's going to go to publishing very soon. It's in final stages. It's been underway for more than a year, and it's scheduled to be available this fall, assuming we don't have any other major crises, like a second virus or something, I don't know. But that's the plan, and it's a soft cover, beautiful book, and is much more than just a new edition, really. It's so much more new material, and it's possibly going to be offered for as little as $20, which I think is going to be amazing. It'll be available from NHS and on Amazon. Okay, well, if we have time left, Vicki and Claudina, we would be happy to take questions.
Excellent. Thank you, guys. This was such an incredible presentation. I am so impressed with your research skills and how you've all worked together to put together such a comprehensive presentation. Thank you so much.
You're most welcome.
Let's see, I invited some folks to type in any questions they may have in chat. I haven't seen anything pop up yet. If anybody I'll keep my eye open in our participants list. If anybody wants to raise their hand, I could invite you to unmute yourself to ask a question, or if you have a comment too about Newcastle history. I know these guys often rely on audience members for some interesting facts about Newcastle history. It takes a team to get history recorded.
It certainly does. And we'd like to say also, a number of times somebody has come up in an in-person presentation and said something which has sparked some more research. That's a little harder to do in this format, but we do encourage you to contact us through the library or through the contact form on the NHS website, and we'd love to hear from you if you've got something to contribute.
I see Cecilia's raised her hand. Cecilia, if you'd like to unmute yourself, please go ahead.
Oh yeah, hi. I was just wondering if there's any place where you can see any of the pieces of what you talked about, like the mosquito fleet or the trains or still the pilings or things like that.
Yeah, so that photo from 39 was about the last of the pilings on Lake Washington. They were being removed one lot at a time as people bought that land to build houses. They obviously didn't want big old pilings in their, view of the lake. The coal cars on the bottom of the lake are really about it. Most of the coal company equipment was recycled as the mine continued to expand and use newer and newer equipment. Guys, can you think of anything else? I mean, there's a piece of the ant.
Can I just real quickly interject something about the coal cars?
Yeah.
We've talked to Mohi a little bit. We're trying to look at maybe getting a couple of these things up so that you can do that, so that you can go and see and get them restored. There's a little bit of the cut that Gary was talking about, but that's on private property and you can't really tell. So I think our best shot for everybody is to just get a couple of these things up off the bottom, put them out at Mohi and maybe a few other places and let you go in and look and see what it really was. And, again, be seeing real coal that came out of it.
Yeah, the ant unfortunately was recycled during a scrap drive for World War II, I think, if I remember right. But there may be a piece of it, like a side rod or something, down at that museum is that in Longview?
Cowlitz County Museum, Historical Museum.
Yeah.
Thank you. Good question. That's for the May Creek trestle, which was used for Route 5. But the trestle itself doesn't exist.
Right.
We've got a comment from Nathan Proudfoot. He says, working on a project on openhistorycalmap.org and would love to include your data directly on OHM. See what contributors are doing for early Seattle on the website. Bob, I didn't see that he sent a link, but look for, openhistoricalmap.org.
Got it. And I believe Nathan's connected to me on Facebook. At least we were in a couple of groups together, like the Eastside Freight group. So Nathan, feel free to reach out to me on Messenger or something. We can get connected.
We've got a question. Can you share about the dances that passengers came to Newcastle to attend? What were the demographics like? Yeah, so
that stuff was covered in the newspaper. It was big news in those days. It seems to me, guys, if I remember right, that Newcastle was not like some company towns, and it wasn't just all unmarried male miners. There certainly were many of those, but pretty early on, families lived there. So it seemed like the dances were both to kind of just maybe introduce some eligible young men to some women, but there weren't a lot of women who weren't already married in Seattle in those early days. But they pretty early had a church there, and so I think the church was involved in some of that. Yeah, we wish we knew more about it, but those events were covered in the newspaper.
Thank you. We have got a question. Which edition of Timber Times was that article on the ant in? Do you recollect?
Right, yeah, John Taubeneck's article. Let me see here. That's, we've got that reference here, whether it's fully detailed in the presentation. Timber Times, January 2008, issue 42, I believe, page 30.
Nice, thank you. In that 1875 picture of the cut to Lake Washington, how did the coal cars make a 90-degree turn?
Right.
Well, that's a good question. We really haven't figured out that part of the process. They had to do it. We don't know the gory details about how it was done. And they had to do it on 10-minute intervals. And not only did the full coal cars have to do a 90-degree turn, of course, the empty ones did too to go back up the incline. But really don't have a good answer to that question.
They were really short wheelbase cars. So, there was probably some people handling them. Harry, you might have mentioned, or Gary might have mentioned, that steam donkey might have been used, or a different steam donkey might have been used to help encourage them. But it wasn't like a railroad at the bottom of the incline. I mean, there were rails, but they would have moved much more slowly, and probably with horses or the steam donkey or people chaperoning them.
We have a comment. Somebody just put maybe the same turning system that San Francisco cable cars.
Yeah, that's a huge hole, and we keep hoping that engineering drawings or something will turn up of that, but nothing so far.
We enjoy giving these presentations is because maybe somebody in the audience might know the answers to questions like that.
Do you know if Pleasure Point is a natural point or man-made for any purpose related to coal mining?
It's
natural.
Natural, yes.
Okay.
It wasn't, there wasn't as much shoreline there, of course, until the lake was lowered, but.
Excellent. Okay, and how big is Wilburton Trestle relative to the May Creek Trestle?
We just looked at that, didn't we, Gary and Russ?
Yeah, so I can answer that.
Asking that question.
The May Creek Trestle is 125 feet tall, or was 125 feet tall. The Wilburton Trestle is 100 feet tall. So it's 25 feet taller than the Wilburton Trestle. And the May Creek Trestle was about 100 feet longer than the Wilburton Trestle. So the Wilburton Trestle is pretty big, but the May Creek one was quite a bit bigger.
They built 2 of them.
Yeah, at least. And we know the standard gauge trestle was rebuilt at least once because of age.
And we did have a comment here. Somebody just wants the general folks to know that the coal mine exhibits in a railroad turntable base are at the old Coal Creek town site, which is now called the Red Town Trailhead at Cougar Mountain.
Yeah, thank you, Don. It's good to see you pop up there. Don's a friend of ours, Matt and mine, in Kirkland history.
Is that Don Winters?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Good.
Yeah, there's some good stuff there. Mike Enelkofer, among others, gives tours, and they are really compelling tours.
Yeah, they have all that pretty well scoped out. The turntable area, and Steve too, goes and does that with Mike. But you can go up and do some of those walks, and they've got all that stuff up there. I encourage everybody to do it. It's really cool, and they're very flat, easy walks.
Yes.
I brought a 5-year-old recently named Benji who had a great time. So I encourage everybody to do that.
Yeah, and I think does Steve works through Issaquah Alps to lead those? I'm trying to think where to refer people to.
Is it that, or is it, he used to be Eastside Heritage, and he's done all kinds of things. What is he with?
Yeah, Russ, do you know with the tours what they officially roll up under?
I don't know the official.
Mike's here. Maybe Mike knows.
We actually do it through all 3 organizations. So if we do a hike, we advertise through Eastside Heritage Center, Issaquah Alps Trails Club, and Newcastle Historical Society.
Okay.
Because of COVID, we aren't doing anything right now.
Oh, okay. Well, I just posted a link to the Issaquah Alps website, so that can be a resource when things start opening up a little bit. Let's see, let me see. Where is the location of the south end terminus of the May Creek Trestle?
So if we interpret south meaning west, the end closest to the lake, it's essentially just east about a block and a half or 2 blocks, maybe 3 blocks of Kennydale Elementary. It's in behind a small housing development at the end of a dead-end street, off the end of a dead-end street. And we have high hopes that Renton Parks at some point will develop that, because the right-of-way, the grade behind those houses is still there. It would be great to see them develop that as a trail access point, because there's a trail back in there now, but it'd be great to see a trail access point put in there. Hint, hint, Renton Parks.
Okay, I think that we have covered all of our questions that were in chat. I'm just reviewing to see if we have any raised hands. So we may be wrapping up, guys. Lots of thank you, wonderful presentation. One last one. Where's the north end of the May Creek Trestle?
It's below street level. There's a housing development, and the Newcastle Trails site that Eva just posted there has some maps, and there's a trail access down out of that neighborhood. It's less than 5-minute walk, and you basically end up right where the trestle connected. It's not 100% obvious because the land has been kind of shifted there, but all of a sudden you just feel like you're on a railroad grade. So if you just turn around and look the other way, that's where you would walk off into space on the trestle. And if you look down, you can see these big things, which are called sills, S-I-L-L-S, which the vertical members of the trestle sat on.
There's a
Newcastle
kiosk at the top of that trestle location with an interpretive set of signs.
That is going to happen, Russ, or has happened?
It exists. In fact, we're going to do some refurbishing here this fall if we can.
Great.
So Vicki, I'll add that where the incline crosses,
Thank you, Eva.
crosses the East Side Rail Corridor, the old railroad right-of-way, they're in the process of widening that from 12 to 20 feet as part of the widening of 405. But once that's done, the end of this year, we'll be posting some trailhead signs so people know where the incline crossed the railroad corridor, and also publicize the story.
And thanks to Bob Boyd on our team for doing a lot of survey work there. That was fun with Harry.
Well, all right. I
have one little question from Barb.
Oh, yeah.
Hi, Barb.
Hello there, you all. This has been absolutely fabulous, having watched you from the beginnings, and now look at you. This is amazing. I am just blown away. This research and all the rest of it is just fascinating. I mean, I have just a little question for Matt, maybe. Have any other coal cars been found in the bottom of Lake Washington, or do we know of any more that are up there by Madison Park or elsewhere?
No, that was the only barge load that flipped. Was just the one, and it's pretty likely that is accurate record keeping, because a lot of people don't realize railroads and coal companies, their rolling stock had a lot of value, so they kept pretty good records. There's a rumor of pretty much every lake in the state that you can name claims to have a locomotive in it or something else, but in fact, when you look at, including Lake Warren, of course, which doesn't, there just aren't that many. And so, that was the only instance we've been able to find recorded of cars going into lake. There are a couple of instances where they went down shooting and careening down the end of the incline, but then they pulled them right out. So there's no real evidence that any are on the bottom other than the 1875 ones we've talked about.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that the lake has preserved the wood and all? I have a nephew who works in maritime restoration. He's worked on the Vasa ship in Sweden.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm just curious, they're beginning to think that having dredged that up from the bottom maybe was not a good idea because she's starting to disintegrate. So I'm just curious about bringing up coal cars, or have anybody have any idea about that?
That's a good question. They are preserved on the bottom, but the problem with being on the bottom is that they're also subject to anchored chains or pipelines or almost anything else you can name damaging them down there.
Mm-hmm.
So when you bring them up, you have to go through a state of restoration. But there are airplanes on the bottom of Lake Washington that were intact and really, really nice back in 84. So it's 83, 84, when I first started diving on them, that have had tails pulled off of them, are just really beat up now and just getting destroyed because, they're sitting in the bottom of the lake, they're rusting away and what have you. So I would say probably the Vasa is better being up where it is now preserved, even if there are some problems, than it is sitting down in the mud. And likewise, I think that would be the case with the coal cars.
Mm.
Let me add that Texas A&M actually has a program at their university that does marine archaeology, and we've been in contact with them, and we would have one of their grad students on site when we began the process. The key is to keep it all wet until you're able to get the cellulose replaced by epoxy resin, and then you might have a chance of saving the wood.
All right, guys, last question here. Are there any signs along May Creek Park Trail of the rail line and where it was and where the trestle was?
Yes. It's referenced on the Newcastle Trails map from the Trails group, but I mentioned the kiosk at the end of the trail which is the old right-of-way, there is a set of maps and photographs of the trestle.
Excellent. All right, folks, I think we are going to wrap it up. This has been a phenomenal evening. So Eva's still on the line here. So we had somebody ask if there was a way to pre-order the book. How are people going to be able to get the book when it comes out? Should we just have them follow the Newcastle Historical Society webpage, Facebook page, and we'll make announcements, Newcastle Trails.
Eva can also say a little more about that. I know it's going to be for sale on Amazon too, but if we could unmute Eva, she's got some more info too.
Okay, yeah, go ahead, Eva, if you want to unmute yourself.
Hi, this is Eva. Yes, if you want to sign up for notification about the book when it comes out, go to newcastlewallhistory.org and sign up there, and we will send you a message when the book comes out. And we'll also be posting notifications on the Newcastle Historical Society website and email list, and also on the Newcastle Trails website, I think, at this point. So yeah, if you wanna hear more about the book, go to newcastlewallhistory.org and sign up there.
And I definitely hope to work with Eva and this team here to try to do a book launch or something via Zoom or something like that. So keep an eye on KCLS too. So hopefully, I understand maybe later this fall it will be out. So
that'd be great. And there's some people, there's some people beyond our group that were very involved in writing book chapters. So it'd be fun to see them get some some kudos.
Awesome.
Yes, we would love to do a presentation, Vicki. So we'll be in touch.
All right, me and Claudine will be back on the job. See you in a couple months. All right, folks, this has been a phenomenal evening. Thank you all for attending. Thank you to our wonderful presenters. Thank you, Russ, for instigating this whole project and where it has come. It's been a phenomenal journey to see it unfold.
Thank you.
Thank you all.